first invitation that we would give in this method is called pleasures of presence. And really, it's about attuning to your body. Again, your body is nature. So it's not a separate activity. You are attuning to a nature being called you. And, we would walk through, what does this place sound like? What's the furthest sound that you hear? What's the closest sound you can hear? Does this place have a melody, a rhythm?
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This week, our guest is Julie Brams. Julie Brams, MA, LMFT, is an earth-centered psychotherapist, meditation practitioner slash teacher, and the author of The Nature Embedded Mind. The Nature Embedded Mind is a groundbreaking new book at the intersection of psychology, ecology, and social justice. Drawing on clinical practice, evidence-based methodology, and scientific research, Julie Brams shows how healing our disconnection from the earth is the next frontier of psychology. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I was really excited when I heard about your book because I'm somebody who is interested in a lot of psychology. And of course, I do work on environmental issues. And I have a belief that our ecological crisis comes from a deeper root than simply, oh, look at what the corporations and government are doing, right? There's a psychological disconnect. And your book really gets into that and doesn't just point out the problems. It says, here's a way that we can address this. So I guess my first question would be, why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah. I decided to write this book, well, I'll say because of my frustration with maybe a kind of a lack of moving the needle forward, in terms of something that is called eco-psychology. This is not a new concept, where it does speak to the relationship, the human role in ecology or environmentalism. But find in my profession to this day, it doesn't really take it to heart, or, maybe elevate it to the level of importance that I think it really requires. And so after a lot of time, in my own journey of understanding, as a psychology person, as a mental health professional, as someone who works with minds all day long, what role is my role in environmentalism, if we're going to call it that? Um, and how do I express and explain what I found, not only to clinicians, but to lay people, which again, psychology, I'm trying to um, pull it out of an academic lens and really let it be about your mind is your psychology, your psyche, your mentalizations, everything that goes on in your awareness, your consciousness, your thoughts. That's the psychology I'm talking about. And then these systemic structures that I think hold us back, which I think what you're talking about too. It's like, what is it about these systems that are in place that keep us, just sort of treading the same ground and not moving it as far as I think we could be.
That's excellent. And you don't have to go in depth for this, but could you give people just a really quick overview of what eco psychology is for those who don't know?
Yeah, eco psychology, I write about it in the book, and I'm much better than I'm going to answer right now, but it's basically making the claim, and that gives it a lightness that I don't like, but it asserts the reality that our mental health has to do with how we are doing in relationship to our environment. That, I mean, this gets into where I usually go on my rants is about this idea, seriously, this idea that we have implanted that we are separate from, that we're somehow superior to, that we're able then to dominate, extract, do whatever we want to the rest of nature because we're this special species. And that's frankly insane. To me, that's insane. And I think eco psychology maybe is a little more, I want to say tactful than I can be. I tend to be kind of blunt and fiery. So I'm working a lot on taking what has been developed through this movement, eco psychology movement, and pushing it in my way, hoping to push it a little bit further, which is why I kind of renamed it. Um, I call myself an earth-centered psychologist because when I spoke to people out in the world about eco psychology, they said, "Oh, yeah, I recycle."
Mm.
And I was like, this is so far off the target. So when I say earth-centered psychologist, people are curious. They're like, what is that? And once you have curiosity, you're in the right ballpark, because then we can start to consider what needs to be unlearned, dismantled, relearned, remembered. So,
Yeah, I love that. So your book really centers around this practice of basically forest therapy. I can't remember how do you what do you call it when you take people out there? Is that what it's called?
yeah, it's nature and forest therapy. Again, the language is so important. I was certified through the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy. That's the model that I talk about in the book. That's the model that I promote. And I say, why? Why am I choosing that over the many other, you know, nature therapies? But there's a reason. Um, but again, people's minds get stuck on things. And so if you say forest therapy, which is what this is based on, translation of the Japanese term Shinyin Yoku, which is highly researched, very well known in Japan. Um, and so Shinyin Yoku is bathing in the atmosphere of the forest. We call it forest bathing. If you say forest bathing or forest therapy, people say, I don't live near a forest, so I can't do it. So it's again like relanguaging to make this accessible and to really work tenderly with people's resistance. Mental resistance is a thing, and it's got to be cared for, not like slammed away, but to really care for what's the resistance. So when I say nature therapy, or yeah, I usually say nature therapy. There are still misunderstandings of it, but at least it points to it's any other than human being. It can be your pet, it can be a tree, it can be the ocean, it can be any other than human being is then your therapist. So that's another distinction. Who's the therapist?
Yeah, I love that piece as well. The facilitator, the guide is the human being, right? So obviously it's kind of instructing somebody, here are the things you want to do, here's the practices, here's what you might want to do with that tree or whatever. But the idea that nature itself is the therapist, I think that's pretty cool.
Mhm. And that I think is beginning to straighten out our our mind that has been, you know, mm, kind of stolen from us in a certain way. I'm
Yeah, well,
talking a lot lately about mental sovereignty. So,
Forest is definitely my therapist. I live up against National Forest and I go for 3 walks a day. I
mm,
break up my work day through that. It's physical health, of course, right? Get away from the computer, not staring at it, move my body. So there's definitely some physical exercise components, but I'm inhaling tree fumes, I'm inhaling good air. I'm seeing critters. I have this little place that's not far from here that we were able to protect from this road they wanted to build in. It's this old growth grove of mostly spruce trees, which are pretty rare at this elevation, about 8,500 feet here in Colorado. And I call it the Druids Grove because it's this circle. Part of it has this circle in the acreage, and I just picture druids, I mean, doing sacrifices and stuff out there. I write eco horror, so that's another topic for another day. But to me, that's like a pleasant image. The idea of druids out there in the forest.
Yeah.
Anyway, maybe I need therapy to talk about that piece of it. But I know that that's really a huge benefit for my mental health. And I think of it comparing to other times where I lived, say, more neighborhoody places. And yeah, I'd go for my walks, but it wasn't the same. It was more distractions, it was more irritations. I couldn't completely sort of abandon myself the way I do out there. I feel free to just like mutter to myself. And once in a while, a hiker comes down the trail and catches me talking to myself, and I have to pretend that I was like talking on the phone or something like that. But anyway, uh, yeah, the book I found really fascinating, and I love how it did get in depth into these practices, but at the same time, it's saying this is not a handbook for it. This is your take on it, your perspective on it, and I found it really accessible. And I'm wondering about, yeah, what could those of us say who consider themselves to be environmentalists, what could we do to get this practice out there more, do you think?
Hmm. Well, I think, again, going back to my lane, which is psychology, it's consciousness. So not just psychology, the way we think about it, but I'm, very curious about consciousness and human potential and reality. But, really like, looking at reality, in terms of, what are we not just thinking about, but what do we know through our lived experience? Um, so where I start with everybody is looking into your own mind. So before we would get to the question of how do I bring this out, it's how do I clean this inner up and really looking at the damage that was done. And, I'll use your language where we were uprooted, where we were torn out of the earth, where we were severed from our connection with the earth. So if you look into your mind, the first, I mean, of course, the way this was done is perfect for your horror. It's an actual horror story of what happened to people who were indigenous and connected to the land and understood that all life is sentient and could be in communication or communing with the other than humans. So yeah, it's a horror story of what happened. And the first idea is this separation. You're separate from. That's that original, like whatever, uprooting or severing from reality because we're not separate from Earth. Our bodies don't do well without Earth, they die. Our bodies are Earth, our mind is our body. So our mind is the Earth. It's kind of trying to I call it rerouting, actually, the practices that I do, rerouting our mind back into the rest of nature, back into reality. Um, but first, you have that separation, and then once you separate out, then the next mental problem is ranking. So once they're separate, now we're going to rank who's higher, who's lower, who's better, who's worse. These superiority, inferiority, even equality is a concept that only works in a ranking system. So kind of looking at that as the next assault on our mental sovereignty, because nature does not rank. There isn't something higher or lower. It works as a harmonious ecosystem, and so do we when we're in our right mind. Um, so once you have a ranking system, now you can deploy domination. That's the next assault on our humanity and our planet. Once there's domination, and these might go hand in hand, but I'm just sort of putting them in an order. You have extraction. So now I'm dominating this thing. I'm extracting what I want from it for my own use. That is completely unnatural. And, because we've been living with this paradigm for, a few thousand years or so, we have pretty much come to believe that's just human nature. That's just how humans are. And that is flatly not true. We can look to other cultures that are still indigenous and see that that is not the only way to be. We're just looking at Western civilization, a Western mind, or this dominator mind. And but it's sort of like what is it? It's like, what's that circular reasoning, right? Like, because it's happening, it must be our nature. And if it's our nature, then it has to happen. And then it's happening, so that must be what we do. And if that's what we do, then we should do that. There's no way out unless you can get into your own mind and dismantle these things that, yeah, uproot us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. We do have in ourselves as a species an ability to, at least to a certain degree, I would say, coexist, certainly without completely destroying our ecosystem. All humans have some impact, but indigenous cultures clearly had figured out a way to sustain themselves without destroying the land base. And so it's in us if we choose. And it also makes me think of something I learned years ago, the idea of as soon as we started naming things in the world. So I guess language. So we'd have to go back pretty far. And we probably always had sounds for stuff. But the idea of tree, and they're like, oh, well, if that's a tree, what am I? I guess I'm not the tree. I guess I'm different. I don't know if we're going to go back to pre-verbal. I'm not suggesting that as the solution, but it's just an interesting distinction we started making of us and them, and language, in a sense, helped with that separation. It cut us out of the flow. I'm not sure. Obviously, a deer does not have to what we understand, a complex vocabulary. Of course, it has a very complex mind. It understands a lot of things, but I don't know if it necessarily considers itself as separate from its environment. And it's certainly not like here I'm a deer that's Knick or whatever. And it's just sort of like, I'm here, this is here, we're both here, this is in me. I don't know what goes on in the mind of a deer, but I would guess it'd be something like that. Any thoughts on that concept?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts that, it's such a great conversation. But yes, our language, our particular language, is a big problem of how this stays immovable. Um, I want to talk about, if I can, two different lanes. One is this nonverbal communication that you spoke about, which I think is an important part of reclaiming our our natural mind, our natural abilities. And the other is languages that don't encourage separation. So you've got um, people who, for example, Aboriginal language, the symbolism is complex and the stories are embedded in a holistic way. So again, not every language is separatist, if that's the right way of putting it. I think that might be a political term. but doesn't separate us out. It's our language does. And that's again where I feel like I want to keep working towards better language. Letting even, anybody, I'm not claiming to be the expert in this. We're all experts in this if we begin to look inside. But what would the language be? How would you say something in a way that is more this idea of kin-centric? Or, it's a big, big leap, I think, for people to go from where we are to I am the earth itself. That's a hard conceptual leap. But if we can at least get in the ballpark of friends and family with other species, legitimately, not just like a metaphor or poetry, but to really understand, yes, they don't necessarily speak our language, our verbal language, but they're speaking to us all the time. And we are speaking to them all the time, which I think goes back to the nonverbal. And it's different from pre-verbal. So to make that distinction that even between humans, most of where we get our information, this is going into psychology land, we get our information from nonverbal cues. We're picking it up from tone, we're picking it up from body language, we're picking it up from even fragrance, smell that's coming from whomever we're with. And that is a way that we communicate, uh, a primary way we communicate. And then to bring that into the realm of other than human beings, how might we also favor nonverbal communication to see, again, it's experimenting with how might I be able to communicate in ways that I've been told I can't. Maybe I can pick up some way of moving that communicates something, or a sound that communicates something. Um, a rhythm that communicates something. Anyway, there's a lot to this. Moving out of, again, this human-centric language is the epitome of communication. If you can't speak language, you're unintelligent. That's ridiculous. Science, again, proves it over and over that other species have high intelligence, even though they're not going to speak our language of choice.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for their survival, they don't need it. There's no real benefit to that. They are perfectly attuned to their environment. So why overcomplicate things? And we as humans are, I would argue, are more complex, but that doesn't necessarily mean better. And it clearly doesn't mean more suited to being alive and thriving. I think we've gone over complex. Like if there's you can look at in terms of a machine, even though we're not machine, maybe there are certain machines that were made like, wow, this really works well. Like, oh, well, let's add all these other tinkering things, and now the program doesn't work right anymore. It's like, great, it's more complex, it does more stuff. We don't need that stuff. So that's kind of how I frame that. That the consciousness, we don't really know what is the consciousness of a wolf, but they are incredibly intelligent and well adapted. And one can argue a tree leaning towards the light, that's an intelligence there. And one could even say that's sometimes I think about I would prefer to be a tree. And so yeah, that better than or worse than, I do think there's a distinction in maybe that term complexity. And sometimes we give complexity just a positive connotation. I don't think it has to be either or. I think we're more complex. I think my personal take is we're too complex and we at the same time don't know what the hell we're doing. So that is not a good combination, having godlike powers with certainly not godlike consciousness. I'll tell you that much.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think also like the complexity is part, from my opinion, is this. kind of double-edged, gift and curse that we have of a thinking mind. It can go, it can leave the present moment. It can go into the past, it can go into the future. But none of that is real. So um, I think of our thinking mind as a defense mechanism because we are really very vulnerable as a species. We don't run very fast. We don't have, you know, claws, teeth, but we have this thinking mind that wants to always categorize, mostly scanning for problems and logging. Here's all the things that could go wrong, and now I'm going to pay attention to that. And then, on and on. I don't want to get too far into psychology land, but you can see where, like you're saying, it overcomplicates things because it's trying to protect from things that aren't here. Again, you're right. Like we've accelerated technologically so fast that our mind isn't really designed, our thinking mind isn't designed to be able to handle all of that. I will say our intuition is. When we move out of favoring this thinking and we move into more of awareness, um, intuition, things that move quicker than thoughts, we can process it that way. But again, it means we have to practice being in that state of mind.
Mhm.
And our culture mandates that we practice thinking. And that keeps us, again, from moving the needle. Now, is that by design? Is that by accident? I tend to think in some way it's by design that the dominators can keep us from, really responding and moving and being autonomous and in our own sovereignty by distracting us with a lot of stuff that really hurts us, hurts each other, and hurts our planet, hurts the others that we co-create this place with.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think human consciousness is all that great. Obviously, we can do a lot of fancy things. And the first thing that comes to my mind is art. But I
Mm.
realize when I do art, it's me just trying to reconnect back to the source. So it's almost just like a poor excuse for being in the flow. It's a almost a synthetic version of what I think a lot of animals feel. And yeah, I think I might start up a new eco psychology movement called Ant Consciousness. So in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, there are these creatures that are basically trees, but they're kind of humanish. They definitely have human consciousness to a certain degree, but a lot of the time they're in their tree consciousness. And I'm like, that's what I want to aspire to. And so
Mhm.
yeah, I'm gonna start something up called Ant Mind uh, psychology. No,
Yeah.
it would be malpractice because I don't have the qualifications. But
But seriously, it's kind of what I'm doing. It's, maybe I wouldn't call it that, but I am opening these doors as a forest therapy guide or a nature therapy guide, opening the doors to help people connect their mind with a tree's mind, connect their consciousness with any other than human beings' consciousness, and remember that that is a capacity that a human has. Our culture doesn't want us to use it, doesn't give us space to use it. But I'm saying again, as this, what will move the needle forward is a different mind. It's not a mind that we have to fabricate, it's our original mind. And again, we don't have to go backward in time. It's a mind that we are born with. It's a mind we can reconnect to or reroute to. It's a mind that our indigenous contemporaries use. It's not, we don't have to recreate it. We just have to remember how to use it. So I'm all for that, um, me melding minds with a tree or. And we do it with our pets. We
Mhm.
don't shame each other for that. We're allowed to believe that our pet knows who we are, loves us, wants our attention, gets our attention. We have allowed our species, certain other species, to bond with and not be shamed or ridiculed or humiliated. But that to me again is very odd and suspicious. Like
Mhm.
why these animals are okay, but if I say I'm communicating with a boulder, you're gonna lock me up. It's like that's that's an artificial divide.
Yeah,
If you do spend enough time with a boulder, you will understand something.
sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's where mm, where the creativity comes in, where but through lived experience we can challenge what we're taught isn't possible.
Right. Yeah. I think that's perfect. And I want to get into a couple maybe specific examples of nature and forest therapy. But first, I wanted to just make a few other outlandish comments. So, yeah, I think the idea of communicating with a tree. So I do a lot of forest protection work. In fact, like the chainsaws stopped out there, which is nice. But I think trees would not be happy with us. I think they'd be like, come on, man. Like that's what I think they'd be saying a lot of time. I like to also think that they know I'm trying for them and maybe they would be happy with that. I walk out there in pretty heavy windstorms and no tree has ever fallen on me. I did see one that fell out while I was out there. I'm like, well, if that's what happens, that's what happens. I don't worry about that.
Mhm.
But there's this entity called the Green Man, and it comes from Celtic British folklore. It's in a lot of different cultures, but it's been most encapsulated in an image of basically it's a dude with leafy green beard, leafy hair, leafy eyebrows. And it's common in the UK at pubs. They call them the Green Man, and they're somewhat in literature. And to me, it symbolizes that connection or break of connection between humanity and nature. And I collect imagery of that. Like if I
Mhm.
can find a thing that has Green Man, I collect it. And I found my favorite one, which is the angry Green Man, because a lot of them they're just like these placid, yo, what's up? And I'm like, I don't think they'd be saying yo, what's up all the time. I think they'd be like, come on, can we get something together? So I have this one mug. I don't have it right here, otherwise I'd show you. And it is kind of it's a furious green man, and I kind of identify with that. At the same time, I think there's a lot of they might realize if they do have a consciousness, this very likely fictitious green man, that they're like, all right, humans will pass. Maybe they'll figure it out, and maybe they're not going to waste a bunch of time being angry. But I'm sure if there is a green man. If there are green men or green women, that's whatever. That this image is just the green
Yeah.
man. That they would be a little bit frustrated with us. And the last piece of this is, I think you'd like this. So there is a forest advocate by the name of Andy Mahler, and he worked in his whole life in the upper Midwest, and he passed away recently. And I had him on the podcast before he passed away, which I was really grateful for. And actually, we thought we lost the whole audio, and we were trying to get him back on, but he was ill and it wasn't working. And then he passed away. I'm like, man, I never got. And then I went back, and the pretty much 90% of it was fine.
Mhm.
So it's beautiful to have saved that. But what he says is, and he says this, I believe, in all seriousness, I am the forest defending itself.
Mhm.
Like I am an offshoot of the forest. We came from the forest, as ape creatures. You want to go back further than that, but just evolving as ape creatures in the forest. It was our home, our protection, our food, our everything. And so why not think about that? So maybe obviously I think most humanity as a whole is a threat to the forest, but let's say for whatever reason that evolved, and then the forest is like, we better have some element of this that is basically the forest itself trying to protect itself. So I don't know. What do you think about that
I think
idea?
that's exactly right. And it speaks to this, what I consider like sort of that final conscious frontier, which that you do understand you are the forest, you are the ocean, you are the mountains. We are the species that kind of has some of these, unique. abilities. I'm not talking about the ones that we tend to use all the time. I don't think those are the abilities that we were kind of put here for or born out of the earth for. I don't. But yeah, this idea that we are, again, if we go to just the level of kinship, I can be the species that protects my kin, my tree kin, my tree people. Again, yeah, I love that idea of the green man. And I wanted to also suggest, if you're curious enough or if you're open to it, to ask the trees what do they think about what you're doing, to really sit with them. And this is where it starts to, in the book, I have a chapter on crazy, silly, woo-woo, weird, because when we are breaking this perceptual cage that we're in, it should feel very awkward and strange and almost like, we will shame ourselves out of taking this leap in consciousness or taking our sovereignty back. Those cognitive bars feel really strong. They're illusion, but as you're passing through it, you might say, like, can I really ask this tree, what does it think of me? But if you sit with the tree without expectation for 20, 30 minutes, you might hear directly from the tree what it wants from you, what it sees you doing, I mean, it's certainly on a biological level, we're always in communication with the trees. We know that we're breathing together. Science has shown us that their immune system is boosting our immune system. Like, there's a lot of communication going on anyway. But to bring it to this, like maybe intuition or heart-centered place, or um, yeah, just it's hard to describe, but awareness, let's say, not thinking, but just letting yourself be aware. What do you notice when you're with the tree? Is there sometimes people have heard sentences, but maybe there's an image, maybe there's a sound, maybe there's a feeling, maybe there's a sensation or an impulse that to just suspend your disbelief and allow that it could very well be the tree answering your question or giving you some information, maybe about something else. But this is the kind of stuff when, as a guide, I or any other guide leads people out into nature with this kind of invitation, the stories and the experiences that come back sound pretty impossible. But when you see 30 people all having some kind of experience, like true experience in their body, in their heart, in their mind, it gets harder and harder to say it's not true.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's also great in terms of, I think a lot of the audience of the Green Root podcast are involved in some form of advocacy. So a special version maybe of this is, yes, communing with the nature. So let's say in my case, trees, forests nearby here, and also asking them, yeah, what can I do for you? What are there things that should be done for you? You know, how can I help? What are your thoughts about us and things like that? I'm definitely going to try that. I think that's really interesting, and that could apply specifically, like I said, for those who are doing this work. And we do consider ourselves to have a connection with nature, but maybe we've never consciously tried that specific approach. I think that's great.
And I thought also when you mentioned the ring of trees, it's would be really cool if you wanted to go to each of them and get each of their opinion because they aren't all the same. Just like we all are human, but we don't have the same personality or the same everything. you might find, I mean, I think this is again where not to predict anything, that's an important part of guiding, that I'm not going to tell you what to find, but to explore, become curious, spend time with each tree and notice, you know, just notice. It's very illuminating.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely gonna give that a try and maybe I'll summon a druid by accident. But yeah, I'll focus on the
Yeah.
trees themselves. But so yeah, maybe if you can give us another example of what this nature and forest therapy might look like. And then I want to tie it into this piece I had written before called, well, we'll get into that in a second. So, yeah, maybe give an example. Obviously, your book, read the book, folks, and then
Yeah.
you will get many examples, but maybe just one little teaser.
Yeah. I think, the um first invitation that we would give in this method is called pleasures of presence. And really it's about attuning to your body. Again, your body is nature. So it's not a separate activity. You are attuning to a nature being called you. And, we would walk through, what does this place sound like? What's the furthest sound that you hear? What's the closest sound you can hear? Does this place have a melody, a rhythm? And then adding your own sound into the soundscape. Maybe it's just as simple as noticing the sound of your breath, or noticing maybe swallowing, or if you're brave enough or curious enough, adding in a tone, a word, again, a rhythm through clapping or snapping, or, but to begin to recognize the intertwine of you as nature with the rest of nature through at least the five senses. Human beings have more than five, but we kind of focus on the five that we're most accustomed to tuning into. But it is from this angle of yourself embedded, embodied in the web of life, this one living being named Earth that we are all co-creating.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah.
So, so why I found this topic so relevant to what's going on in my life, I'm getting a lot of synchronicities is I had just recently written a piece called Yin Yang of the Environmental Movement. And I did a little solo podcast on it that hardly anyone listened to, but the article got out there. And in it, I used the Eastern Taoist concept of yin yang. I dumb it down because I don't really have a real in-depth understanding, but I have enough of one if I like to talk about it. But basically the idea of yin as being, yang as doing. You can say yin is more passive, yang is more active. It's more complicated than that, but that's the basic framing. And I tied it into the environmental movement, and I gave an example of yang, which I personally tend to identify more with is kind of like, let's say, a protest out in the forest, maybe some tree sit or something like that. That's a perfect example, I would say, of a yang, like energy. We're out there, you can't do this. And then I gave an example of yin, which I state very clearly, yin and yang are both equally important and hopefully should be in balance for a successful movement. So the yin component would be, my example was being out in the forest, attuning yourself to nature, and the necessity of that in terms of if you're not connected to nature, you're not going to do any other thing. And you are, really, really kind of joining with it. And also the yin ability of some folks to vibe with people, maybe even in human institutions, whereas folks like me, we tend to just sort of like butt heads with it. There are other folks who, without selling things out, which I get into the shadow of yin or whatever, yin and yang. But anyway, so I thought it was perfect. I'm like, well, this is the yin that I'm talking about that is so essential, and I would argue is often not being engaged in, people being a part of nature, joining with it, and your version of this with this version of eco psychology and nature and forest therapy is a very mindful, conscious way to engage with that yin. So what do you think? Would you classify it as yin? Is that oversimplifying it?
No, yeah, I love this. I'm really curious, like where you would put this, because my experience of it is kind of yang.
Hmm.
It's it's inner activism. It is the forefront of um, I will reclaim the earth, starting with my own mind and body, and with that in like in coordination with the rest of nature. So it's an interesting, but I hear what you're saying that it's maybe not a an outward action. I think the outward action flows from the inner action. This is part of what I believe as a mental health person. And I think, a lot of people understand that our actions follow our thoughts. So that's where I'm saying sort of like I'm the yang of the inner world. Like let's get in there and dismantle this stuff because it is holding us back in ways that we're numb to or blind to. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then you're in a whole different trajectory. And every action that you take from that premise, it might even be the same action, but it's different. It's a different, it's coming from a different source, and so I think about like if you have a broken system in your mind and you're taking the actions, I think you would be doing a good job, but you will stumble because the the premise is weakening you. The premise itself is buckling your knees, or the premise is diluting your effectiveness. So yeah, but I kind of was curious what you would think if this is a yin or a yang, or is it that sweet spot, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, those are really great points. Obviously, I kept the article fairly simple, and the example I used of yin was the forest, just like going out in the forest and being there. So I think an argument that this conscious actions that you take through nature and forest therapy, that can be a version of yang because it's not just a passive, like you are actively pursuing something. So it could be just straight up yang. It could be the yang within the yin or the yin within the yang, because
Yeah.
in the image of the
Yeah.
yin yang, so there's, they join, they're separate, but then there's like a dot inside each of the other one
Yeah,
of
exactly.
the other essence.
Exactly. And
So
it is one
and it is
shape.
one, and it's one
Yeah.
shape. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I've like been very excited to think about it through that question, what you were, posing, the yin and the yang of it. Um, yeah, and also I think just to speak about going out into nature, wonderful, enjoy yourself, great. Yes. And be careful because that is a form of extraction. If you're not giving something back, you are taking with, using that privilege of this so-called human supremacy, which again is killing us. Like, really, like thinking this way, we see what the end of this thought experiment has caused. It's we're gonna die. I think that's for sure. Whether the planet makes it or not, everybody's like, oh, the planet will be fine without us. True, but also no, because the planet gave birth to us and we could be doing something quite important here if we weren't busy trying to extract and dominate. I feel like I got off on a little bit of a tangent,
I
but
don't think that's a tangent at all. No, and I wonder, did you use that term extraction because you're familiar with how much I use that term, or did that just come up on?
oh no, that's a fact. Like I'm looking all the time at, again, because I'm in the mental lane, I'm in the psychology lane. I'm looking at the ways that we extract that we think are quite lovely. Like, oh, I'm gonna go out and enjoy a walk in the woods. Okay, so now you've enjoyed the walk in the woods. What did the woods get? So to really, I don't mean to be a jerk, but I do have a little bit of fire. Um, Simply to say, I'm going out into the rest of nature with these other beings that, by the way, are keeping me alive. I'm not going to just enjoy it. I'm going to give something along the way. I'm going to maybe give water. I'm going to drop some hair consciously, that has minerals in it. I'm going to give gratitude, give love. Like I think a lot about some of these, um, what has been relegated into less than, uh, like we're our culture right now really champions domination and fighting, war. Um, and when it comes to love, that kind of gets relegated to Disney movies, Hallmark. And I'm not talking about that kind. I'm saying let's reclaim. What about a human being, our capacity? You mentioned art, song, dance, love, gratitude as medicines, as actual gifts that we give in return for what we're receiving. Again, this is all to be experimented with. This is really let your mind become curious. What can I give this other than human species, uniquely as a human being? What can I give this other species? That's a beautiful quest. If you just carry that out into your walk, you're already coming out of that cage. And that cage is what I think keeps us from really moving the needle anywhere forward.
Well, yeah, that's pretty mind-blowing because so at Eco Integrity Alliance, which is this podcast is a project of Eco Integrity Alliance, we do grassroots organizing, and most of our focus right now is public lands and it's extraction on public lands. So we typically are referring to logging, grazing, mining, and drilling. We've I've been recently thinking about, if people want to hunt for their own food, I don't personally have a problem with that, even though I don't do it. But I was thinking about just hunting as a form of extraction, fishing, and I don't know if I had gotten to the point of, even though I've thought about human presence on the landscape as just taking, but as going for, just say a selfish hike, just going for a walk as a form of extraction. But the way you frame it, that's really, really interesting. And yeah, I might have a bit more misanthropic view on humanity than you do, but I am very open to the potential that humans have. I think we could be stewards. I don't think that we are. I think we by far do more harm than good, but that doesn't mean we can't. So I'll try to think about that the next time I'm out there. I mean, I'm at the very least extracting dirt with my footprints, right? That's physically happening.
Right, but I think again, I so feel you with that, like I as a species, I'm not that fond of human beings, but at the same time I do also hold on to optimism and again kind of going into as you've been saying, like what is the root of the problem in a human being, certainly it's not nature, the rest of nature isn't messing things up. But to remember we are supposed to interact with each other. It's a really good question to start to sift through what is extractive and what is just hanging out. Like if there's dirt on your shoe and you're bringing it in or whatever, you're moving it from where it was, that's not necessarily wrong, right? Like in a way, we can also be pollinators. We're brushing up against flowers or smelling them and whatever. Like there are ways that as an animal, we are not supposed to treat the rest of nature as a museum piece.
Mhm.
No, we're supposed to get in there and love them and be with them and let them love us and be with us. I think it's really this attitude of, yeah, I'm going to get something and I'm not going to give anything in return. So, yeah, if you're moving the dirt, but what will you do in return? And is that, it's just more about that question. I really do feel like to begin to step outside the cage is to say to the natural world or the rest of nature, what can I do for you? What can I give you? And to learn to listen before we speak, to learn to, like whole body listen. This goes back to sensory awareness or pre-verbal or nonverbal, listening until you get a sense that there's a something and then do that thing, take that action. Um, I think that this paradigm is served really well by a kind of a Buddhist mm, context where in coming into any circumstance, you want to begin with not knowing, you know, letting that mind open. I don't know. I don't know is a good place to start. And then bearing witness. And again, through our senses, watching, listening, attuning, asking, what can I do for you? Or what do you need? Sometimes the answer is nothing. I don't need anything from you. Okay. But we're asking, what can I do? And then if there is, oh, this is the thing, take that healing action, take that kind action. That's a whole different system. If human beings came back into, again, I'm going to say reality and sanity, came back into their natural mind, we would have a very different culture. It would still have all the technologies, but lots of things I think could change. Economics, um, the things that create all of that weird desire for extraction. I don't know. That's some of my thoughts. They're not, that's just the top of my head kind of.
No, no, this is great. And that's the discussion. And you're one of the best people to have this with. And yeah, so I mean, I feel like I'm getting a free th therapy session here. So, I'll give you an address to send the bill, I guess. But so speaking of bills, where can people find the nature embedded mind so they can purchase that excellent book?
Yeah, you can purchase it anywhere you like to buy books, where it's out there. If you want a signed copy, you can go to my website, experienceelemental.com. That's where you can hit me up for a book and I'll sign it and send it to you. Yeah, but you can get it anywhere. And the other thing I would say is if it does open up curiosity, which again the book is, as you said, it's just an introduction to a way of being, a conversation. It's the book itself is not the thing. But I do offer a rerouting course, a cohort that is comprised of humans and other than humans in the cohort. So we're all learning together from other than humans as well. We're practicing what this is about. The practice of this is going to be where the change comes. just like weightlifting. You know,
Mhm.
if you don't actually lift the weight, you can understand weightlifting, but if you don't lift the weight, the muscle doesn't build. So same, this is not just a concept, it's a practice. And yeah, so I'm
Uh,
happy to help anyone learn more, understand more. It's a slippery concept. So,
No, that all sounds great. And yeah, I'm sure just your average person, but also activists who focus on environmental protection, that would be very relevant. So yeah, Julie obviously knows her stuff. So reach out to her, get her book. And so the last question I always ask on the Green Root podcast, when I don't forget to ask it, is what do you think a root cause is of the eco crisis?
yeah. Well, I think, very clearly, I think a root cause is our mental paradigm that has been damaged. I mean, we can trace it historically where that severance came, where we were uprooted. And we do have ways now to reroute. So I think that at least one core root problem is the way we're thinking.
Yeah, no, that's I tend not to give away my take on the root stuff. I let my guests do it, but yeah, that's personally where I think it has to go. We do have to do things, you could say like pruning branches or however you want to frame it. Because I mean, the analogy is not perfect because it's like roots are a good thing, but in this case, it's like what is the root so we can pull it up. So, leaving that aside, um, I do think it is this mental or even spiritual disconnect and disconnect from nature. And we can certainly put legislation in place to protect public lands. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
But at the heart, we really to have more people who are, you can call it biocentric or just at least appreciative of nature, realizing we're a part of it, depend on it, vice versa, whatever. I don't think the bigger changes are really going to happen without those internal changes. That being said, once we have an internal change, we do need to make physical changes in the world as well. So all of it's important. So anyone who's doing anything, I think, in benefit of the natural world, I'm like, cool. Let's just find a way that we can all interface with that. And that's tricky for humans. But anyway,
I will say one more thing, just in the terms of the people who are fighting the right fight, activism. Um, and it is tiring, it is hard, it can be, really demoralizing. So I would like to speak from my experience, as I am rerouting back into the rest of nature, it's easier. It's not like things are rosy. No, it's reality. But the stamina level is different. The source is different. Like there's a lot more we can tap. Like this idea of a tap root. There's more that we can tap when we're in right alignment. And I just want to offer that to those of you, that are really, really doing the important work. I would like to make that easier on you.
yeah, no, I think that's necessary. And yeah, maybe with that sort of work for folks like myself, maybe I will identify less with the angry green man, which tends to be my archetype now, and maybe this more placid green man that's on my wall that I don't identify with as much. Maybe in time I will. I don't know.
There's a place for anger.
There is, but yeah, as the fuel, it's a dirty fuel, I think.
Mm.
So that's all part of the process for us to
Mhm.
figure this out.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the Green Root podcast. Of course, thank you for all your work and for the book. And yeah, folks should definitely reach out to Julie. And thanks again.
You're welcome. Thank you for letting me have this conversation and join minds around it.
Of course.